Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in the book of Leviticus, and this is the third book of the Bible, the third book of Moses. It is also God's operating manual for the priest. Now, as I said, because of that, we're going to skim through a lot of the meticulous commands and instructions for the priest. One, they are meticulous, but two, they don't apply to us in that we're not going to obey Leviticus because it's not written to us. It's written only to the priest to carry out. Now, there are some instructions for the people in that when they sin, they were to present themselves to the priest. When they were healed, they were to present themselves to the priest. You will note, if you read through the Gospels, that every time Jesus healed someone, he always told them, now present yourself an offering as Moses had commanded. So, but it was still the priest they had to go to. This is why we would not follow the book of Leviticus. It is strictly for the Levitical law. So, again, just keep that in mind. Let me go. Let's bring it up. All right. I'm going to start at verse 1 again. Because I'm going to, as you see, I'll do the skimming it through. It says, then the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And again, this was the tabernacle. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any of you bring an offering to the Lord from the livestock, you may bring your offering from the herd of livestock. So this is, so the protocol was, and we get more into this in Leviticus, when they would commit a sin. Now just keep this in mind, there are 27 chapters to Leviticus, all instructions of when you sin, and so man sins a lot. So if you want to also look at this from this perspective, man sins from God's perspective. This is man's sin from God's perspective, not from man's perspective. All right, verse 3, if his gift is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to bring it an unblemished male. And I went through this, and then it says, the sons of Aaron, the priest, will prepare a fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. I want you to take note of that phrase when we get further down into the book. I believe it's, I forget which one. I thought it was Leviticus 18. We're going to come to a chapter where Aaron's sons will offer strange fire and they will be struck down from it. But I want you to see how meticulous this is. How when God is giving them this instructions, I want you to understand that they know this. They have this instruction here. It says, verse 10, but if his gift for the burnt offering is from the flock, from the sheep, the goat, he is to present an unblemished male. I'm going to skip down. Verse 14, if his gift is to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he is to present his offering from turtle doves and young pigeons. I'm going to go to chapter 2. Chapter 2. It says, if anyone presents a grain offering as a gift to the Lord, his gift must consist of fine flour. He is to pour olive oil on it, put frankincense on it, and bring it to Aaron's sons. And then it says what Aaron's sons is going to bring. There was a whole, again, offering for this. Here's interesting, verse 11, no grain offering that you present to the Lord is to be made with yeast, for you are not to burn any yeast or honey as a fire offering to the Lord. Now, yeast, it is often in the course, in some translations, it's leaven or unleavened. Unleavened with anything that's without yeast. We would say today, nothing that has any kind of seasoning in it. As you can see, any kind of seasoning, whatever, it had to be just plain. We would call it plain. Okay. Verse 14, if you are presenting a grain offering of first fruits to the Lord, you must present fresh heads of grain, crushed kernels, roasted on fire. I'm going to chapter 3. He says, if his offering is a fellowship sacrifice, he is presenting an animal from the herd, whether male or female. He must present one without blemish before the Lord. He is to lay his hands on the head of his offering and slaughter it at the entrance of the tents of the meeting. Now remember, we talked about the laying on of hands, as they were to lay their hands on it, and there was a whole bunch of, again, all these instructions that they had to carry out to make atonement for the people's sin. Verse 6, if he is offering a fellowship sacrifice to the Lord from his flock, he must present a male or female without blemish. Verse 12, if his offering is a goat, he is to present it before the Lord. Skipping down, I'm going to go to chapter 4. Chapter 4. Then Moses, now this is going to be an interesting chapter here. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites, when someone sins unintentionally against any of the Lord's commands and does anything prohibited by them, if the anointed priest, okay, this thing got cut off here. All right, let me see something here. I'm going to read this, but I want you to notice he said unintentional sin. Now, when we talk about sin, first and foremost, all sin is to God enough. In other words, there are a couple of ways of looking at this. Let me come out of this because I want to. There are a couple of ways of looking at when we talk about sin, and it's important that we look at this, how the priestly commands are. But let's kind of go back when we talk about sin. First and foremost, a sin is any unrighteousness before God. The actual English word sin, okay, the actual English word sin, this is how it ended up in our translation. It was used in archery. Now, if those of you all, if you're in archery, you know this word very well. But the word sin was, you think about a bullseye, and then when an archer would shoot his arrow, if the arrow missed the bullseye, right, they would say sin. Thus, sin is missing the target, missing the mark. And of course, when we're referring to God, sin is missing God's mark, right? Now, that is very easy to do because God is 100% holy, 100% perfect all the time. Anything in the slightest that is less than that misses God's mark. So, in other words, it doesn't take much to miss God's mark. And keep this in mind, Adam only ate fruit. He didn't blaspheme. He didn't create a pagan worship. He didn't murder. He ate fruit, right? But that he missed God's mark. Why? God said, don't eat it. And he did. Okay, so from that perspective, and then moving forward, all of creation is contaminated by sin. Okay, so when Moses here, when God is giving Moses instruction, so now you talk about, now think about this. He says unintentionally. So think about in your neighborhood, for example. This happened to me around my neighborhood, right? You're driving down your street, and normally, you let's say you drive a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks. Well, someone who has clout talked to the city hall, and they say, well, we're tired of people speeding, so they put a stop sign up. But you don't know they put that stop sign up. So as you're driving through, boom, you blow the stop sign. Well, even though you didn't know the stop sign was there, you still broke the law. It says stop. So this is what he's referring to, that if you unintentionally. Now, later we will see in terms of what happens when you intentionally sin. Now, man's nature will always bring you to that they will intentionally sin. And in general, all sin is intentionally. But we're talking about it that if you have these commands, and remember there's 613 commands, so you're going to unintentionally break one. Maybe you didn't offer the right kind of, or bring the right kind of offering. Maybe you didn't observe the right kind of ordinances, whatever. That's what he is referring to here. If you unintentionally sin, so then he's give all of these kinds of, all of these commands here. We're not going to go through. In other words, what he is talking about, this is now how you make atonement for these unintentional sins. If you sin, okay? Verse 3, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he is to present to the Lord a young unblemished bull as a sin offering. Let me skip down. Verse 13, now if the whole community of Israel errs, and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, so that they violate any of the Lord's commands and incur guilt by doing what is prohibited. In other words, they sin. So in other words, if it's a command of God, but the community now sins. Let's just say everybody forgot the Passover date, okay? Something like that. Okay. Then there is an offering for that. Verse 22, when a leader sins unintentionally and violates any of the commands of the Lord, his God, by doing what is prohibited and incurs guilt, or if someone informs him about the sin he has committed, he is to bring an unblemished male goat as his offering. Then it goes on and tells you the same. Verse 27, now if any of the common people sin. Now the common people, today we would refer to them as lay people in theological circles, but anybody just simply not in the ministry. So now if any of the common people sins unintentionally by violating one of the Lord's commands and does what is prohibited and incurs guilt, or if someone informs him about the sin he has committed, then he is to bring an unblemished female goat as an offering for his sin that he has commanded. Now, then it goes on and tells you all of the, again, the same way that they are to atone. All right, chapter 5 verse 1 says, when someone sins in any of these ways, if he has seen, heard, or knows about something he has witnessed and did not respond to a public call to testify, he is responsible for his sin. Now I want you to know right now, this is what I was referring to when we talk about there are sins that in our minds we say, well, these are not big sins. We don't condemn someone. We won't excommunicate. We won't defrock someone for these kinds of sin. But notice God says they are sins. And remember, in God's standards, any of what he deems as righteous is a sin for you to violate it. And this is one of them. Verse 2, or if someone touches anything unclean, a carcass, or an unclean wild animal, or an unclean livestock, or an unclean swarming creature, without being aware of it, he is unclean and guilty. So regardless, God says don't touch the dead animals. You touch it. Notice that he said, you nevertheless sins. Okay? Verse 4, if someone swears rashly to do what is good or evil concerning anything a person may speak rashly in an oath without being aware of it, but later recognizes it, he incurs guilt in such an instance. Okay. If someone incurs guilt in one of these cases, he is to confess he has committed that sin. Now that's kind of interesting. This is where we kind of get the idea of confession in its many forms. Like, for example, the Catholic way of confession is not scriptural, but nevertheless, you can see where they get it from in terms of scripture. Now, notice he said, you are simply to confess it. No one said that you even had to confess it to anyone other than to God and maybe the priest, but that's it. You're not to just air your dirty laundry in that respect. But the idea of confessing, by the way, is simply agreeing with, admitting to what God says is wrong. So anytime someone would confess to something or refuse to confess to something, and we have a lot of that today, which I won't get into, but there's a lot of thought today in terms of what is sin, right? They kind of like a Clinton, what is, and we're kind of leaving what the righteous standard as set by God. See, as set by God. So think about it. Homosexuality, abortion, all of these things, people are now saying they're not sin, when God will say they're most definitely sin. He says, verse 7, but if he cannot afford an animal from the flock, then he may bring it to the Lord 2 turtle doves or a young pigeon for restitution. And then he says, but if he cannot afford 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, he may bring 2 quarts of fine flour as an offering for his sin. Verse 14, the Lord spoke to Moses, if anyone offends by sinning unintentionally in regards to any of the Lord's command, he must bring restitution offerings to the Lord, an unblemished ram from the flock, based upon your assessment value. I'm going to skip down to this. Oh, let me read this because I think this is kind of interesting here. Verse 16, he must make restitution for his sin regarding any holy thing, adding a fifth of its value to it and give it to the priest. Then the priest will make atonement on his behalf with the ram and restitution offerings, and he will be forgiven. Now, the reason I wanted to read that statement is because, notice, that is how you were to be forgiven under the Old Testament. Okay? Verse 17, if someone sins without knowing and he violates any of the Lord's commands concerning anything prohibited, he bears the consequence of his guilt. Okay? Then the priest, let me go back with, he must bring an unblemished ram from the flock according to your assessment of its value as a restitution offering to the priest. Then the priest will make an atonement on his behalf for the error he has committed unintentionally, and he will be forgiven. It is the restitution offering. He is indeed guilty before the Lord. Kind of interesting, notice that he says that he is guilty. Whenever you sin against God, and God is the one who sets the standards for what he says is guilt, sin, wrong, unrighteousness, that's God's standards, not man. Okay, not man. All right, guys, we'll pick this up in the next study. We're going to move on to chapter 6. All right, I'll see you then.